This is the Tom Bigby Tales, and I'm your host, Shannon Evans. I write about a small town in northeast Mississippi called Columbus. Sometimes I write about the rest of the state. This episode is a continuation of the story of the people who lived in Riverview Mansion and who helped build the city of Columbus. This one is titled The Champion of Women's Rights, Colonel John Gilmer. Colonel John Gilmer was born in Georgia in 1792 during George Washington's presidency. He would become not just a wealthy planter, but also a progressive lawmaker who fundamentally changed the lives of women in Mississippi forever. As a young man of 22, John married his first love, Lucy Thornton Johnson, in a ceremony typical of the Georgia planter class. Together, they built a life in Georgia where John proved himself to be an ambitious and successful planter, cultivating primarily cotton and tobacco. Their family grew to include 6 children: William, Mary, Elizabeth, John Jr., Thomas, and Sarah. Their prosperity was reflected in the growing number of enslaved people that they owned, a common but troubling measure of wealth in the antebellum South. By 1825, Gilmer's plantation had grown to over 1,000 acres. After Lucy's death from yellow fever around 1830, John married Susanna Crawford Barnett Grisham, a wealthy widow who brought her own considerable assets to the marriage, including several hundred acres of prime Georgia farmland. This marriage marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life and likely influenced his later views on women's property rights. By 1835, John moved his growing family to Mississippi, settling near Columbus in Lowndes County, where rich soil and expanding cotton markets promised new opportunities. What made John Gilmer truly remarkable was his forward-thinking approach to women's rights. In 1839, he authored and championed what would become known as the Woman's Law in Mississippi. This groundbreaking legislation was revolutionary for its time. It allowed married women to own property separately from their husbands. Under this law, a wife's property couldn't be seized for her husband's debts or sold without her consent. John Gilmer's groundbreaking analysis of the Mississippi Married Women's Property Act of 1839 transformed our understanding of this landmark legislation. While previous scholars focused primarily on gender equality and economic reforms, Gilmer revealed crucial connections to Native American tribal law, particularly the Chickasaw Nation's influence. His work earned reputation because it introduced previously overlooked Native American perspectives, and it connected multiple historical threads into a cohesive narrative that challenged traditional interpretations of the law's origins. Gilmer's main contribution to law and the state of Mississippi, beyond the Women's Act, was his analysis of the Chickasaw tribal law connection to the Married Women's Act. He identified key economic pressures, including the growing demand for cotton plantation land, the banking and credit practices of the 1830s, the impact of the Panic of 1837, and the role of land speculation in territorial expansion. He provided a unique perspective that went beyond just social and economic factors. Gilmer argued 2 points. He connected the Hadley family to the Fisher versus Allen court case by suggesting there were ulterior motives behind passing the bill. Gilmer meticulously documented how the Hadley family's involvement in Fisher v. Allen in 1837 went beyond simple property rights. This revealed business connections between the Hadley family members and land speculators. It traced financial records showing interest in tribal land acquisition, and it demonstrated how family members lobbied for the act's passage. Gilmer's research also showed that the act served multiple purposes. It enabled Chickasaw and Choctaw women to sell tribal lands independently. It created a larger pool of potential sellers in the land market. It accelerated the transfer of Native American lands to white settlers, and it aligned with federal policies promoting westward expansion. He proposed that the act would make it easier for tribal lands to be sold to white settlers if both Chickasaw and Choctaw women, and not just men, could sell property. Gilmer illuminated how different legal systems, traditional Chickasaw property rights, the federal Indian removal policies, the Mississippi state property laws, English common law traditions, and women's property rights in the 1830s interacted. Some of the key provisions of the women's law were that women could own slaves, livestock, and land independently. Married women could maintain separate bank accounts, and the property brought into marriage by her remained under the wife's control. It allowed that women could write wills and inherit property and provided protection of women's property from their husbands' creditors. Gilmer's work is significant because he revealed previously unexplored Native American influences on the law. He identified potential political and economic motivations behind the Act's passage. His research added depth to understanding why Mississippi became the first state to pass such legislation. Gilmer's work revolutionized the field by introducing interdisciplinary analysis methods and challenging single cause explanations. He encouraged the examination of overlooked historical connections, and his research helped explain why Mississippi led other states in women's property rights, how Native American practices influenced state law, and he examined the complex motivations behind seemingly progressive legislation. Gilmer's work continues to influence modern legal history research methods. It also continues to inform the understanding of women's property rights evolution and the intersection between law and economic policy. The principles established by Gilmer's law would later influence the Married Women's Property Acts of the 1850s, the early suffragist movements, modern community property laws, as well as contemporary women's financial rights. Gilmer's influence extended far beyond lawmaking. He became one of the area's most successful businessmen, helping to build the Gilmer Hotel, a three-story brick edifice that became Columbus's social center. He developed what became known as the Gilmer Road, a vital transportation route connecting Columbus to important trade centers. Those who knew him described Gilmer as a man of simple manners and frugal habits, despite his wealth. He wore plain clothing, preferred substance over style, and was known to quote extensively from Shakespeare and the Bible. He had a sharp intellect and maintained an extensive library, particularly favoring works about politics, religion, and philosophy. His brother James wrote that John was clear-headed, sharp-witted, and attentive to his interests, yet always fair in his dealings. Beyond his famous women's law, Gilmer advocated for other progressive causes. He supported the establishment of Franklin Academy, one of Mississippi's first public free schools in the state. He advocated for better treatment of enslaved people, though remaining a slaveholder himself. He promoted agricultural innovation and crop diversification, and he supported the development of local churches and community centers. When Gilmer died in 1860 on the eve of the Civil War, he left behind a significant legacy. His will reflected his lifelong respect for women's rights. He named his wife Susan as the sole executor of his estate, an unusual move for the time. He ensured his daughters received equal inheritances as his sons, and he established trust funds for his grandchildren's education, regardless of gender. John Gilmer is an important figure in both Mississippi history and the broader story of women's rights in America. Thank you for coming on my podcast, Tom Bigby Tales. Until next time.